Did I just find the best starter adventure for Shadowdark? Hey folks, I'm William, this is Runeforged, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Tomb of the Dusk Queen, a first level adventure by the award-winning Sersa Victory for the Shadowdark RPG. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video where I compare Tomb of the Dusk Queen to the Lost Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur, the first Shadowdark adventure that I ran for my group. Tomb of the Dusk Queen advertises itself as a simple but deadly dungeon delve designed for first level characters. And I think it lives up to that description pretty well. So what comes with the adventure? Well, obviously there is the adventure PDF, which is about 18 pages long, about half of which are rules for the adventure itself, while the other half is more supplemental material. Overall, I think this is a really solid length for a starter adventure. It also includes 2 black and white maps, one that is player facing and one that is GM facing. While relatively simple, the maps are very practical and well laid out, so I don't really have any complaints. You also get a couple pages worth of rumor and item cards that you could print out and hand to your players, which I think is a really nice touch. Speaking of nice touches, if you are enjoying the video so far, please consider nicely touching that like and subscribe button. And if you are not enjoying the video, first of all, how dare you? And second of all, make sure to tell me down in the comments why that's the case, so I can take that into account for future videos. So what do I like about Tomb of the Dusk Queen? First of all, it is well laid out and looks very professionally done. It's got the classic Shadowdark, simple but clean layout. Also, during my read-through, I didn't catch any typos, which is unbelievably rare for a published adventure. But again, in classic Shadowdark style, it is written in very clear and concise language. Essentially, it gives you everything that you need to run the adventure without being overwritten. Like Kelsey, Sersa is able to do a great deal with just a very small number of words, which I very much appreciate. I think that I might even go so far as to say, from a design and layout perspective, especially in terms of usability, this adventure is on par with official Shadowdark content, which is very high praise. That said, there is one thing I do feel the need to call out. Because, as you may know, it's always a great idea to be as pedantic as physically possible when providing feedback. But I do have to say that the rumor chart for this adventure is placed in a very strange location, where you would normally find it before the adventure begins. In this case, it's actually like on the second half of the page after the first room of the dungeon has been described. I can only assume that this was some sort of like limited space issue. And if I'm being honest, it's not really hurting anything by being there. It does feel a little bit out of place. However, to make up for that odd choice of rumor chart placement, I really appreciate that the adventure has a strong and very cohesive sense of theme. It just so happens to fit my personal preferences really well, being not too high fantasy, not too high tech, and not too gonzo, which I really appreciate because I tend to bounce off of a lot of adventures for those reasons. Everything in the adventure feels like it was placed there very deliberately, and it all ties together with the central theme really nicely. There are a lot of interconnected areas and callbacks to things that happened earlier in the adventure, which all feels really nice. For example, there are traps that, if they are sprung, don't necessarily melt the characters immediately, but they put a debuff on you that might come back to haunt you a little bit later in the dungeon. While this does add a little bit more bookkeeping, I find that it really adds to the sense of drama and tension. There are also some pretty cool bits of flavor sprinkled throughout the dungeon. For example, there is a page in the book that is specifically dedicated to things that the final boss will say as they are using their various different abilities. And for some reason, I just find this really exciting. And I almost feel like this should be standard practice in all published adventures moving forward. I don't think that I'm alone in feeling that a lot of boss fights in published adventures are just not as exciting as they should be. And this feels like a very simple way to add a little bit of narrative spice. Speaking of boss fights, the one in this adventure feels like it would be a ton of fun to run. The creature has several cool abilities that feel very dangerous while also being incredibly thematic. I know that Shadowdark's core philosophy dictates that monster design should be kept very simple, only having 1 or 2 abilities per monster. But I definitely think exceptions should be made for boss fights and other particularly dramatic encounters. But what are the things about Tomb of the Dusk Queen that I didn't like as much? Well, I think the biggest issue is that I think there's a pretty good chance that this adventure is maybe just a little bit too lethal for an introductory level 1 adventure. Some of the encounters in here have a combined level of like 7, 8, and even 12, which seems like an awful lot to handle for a first level party. And it's not as though like all of the challenge only comes towards the end of the adventure. Arguably, one of the hardest encounters in the game happens at the very beginning. So it looks like it's possible to TPK your entire group almost immediately after entering the dungeon. And while I think that might be more acceptable for more veteran groups, I don't think it's great for introducing new players to the game. And definitely be sure to let me know how much you disagree with that statement down in the comments. To be fair, there are a lot of very powerful items in this dungeon, and if they are used effectively, they can probably help to mitigate a lot of the difficulty of the encounters. Regardless, since this is advertised as an introductory adventure, I do think GM should consider toning down a couple of the more challenging encounters, especially if they plan to run them for newer players. Also, and this is probably a pretty minor complaint, there is a sword in the dungeon that glows when it's near to a secret door or crawl space. I have a bit of mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I do think it's pretty cool that there's a sword that can help you find secret things, but I do find myself wishing that it was a little bit less binary and a little bit less passive. But it's also very possible that this is not nearly as impactful as I think it's going to be. And I'd be curious to hear other opinions about what y'all think about this item. And finally, another minor complaint is I didn't see any rules for like the default lighting for the dungeon, at least in gameable terms, which Kelsey usually includes towards the beginning of her adventures. Since there are references to light sources later in the adventure, my assumption is that it's assumed that there's total darkness unless otherwise specified, and that all of the creatures are dark adapted, just like the default Shadowdark settings. So what do I think about Tomb of the Dusk Queen overall? In short, I think it's pretty awesome. On paper, it does seem a little bit more lethal than I would prefer for a level 1 adventure, but in practicality, it may be a little bit less lethal than maybe I'm imagining. And regardless of that, it does seem really well designed with a strong central theme and a very fun little boss encounter to cap off your first adventure, as well as a couple very cool magical items to get as a reward. And overall, I'm really looking forward to running this adventure with my own group. If you'd like to check out Tomb of the Dusk Queen for yourself, there's a link to do so down in the description. And if you decide to make a purchase after clicking on that link, it does help to support the channel at no additional cost to you. But let's talk a little bit about how this adventure stacks up against the Lost Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur, which is the official Shadowdark starting adventure, which you can find in the Game Master's Quick Start Guide. In terms of quality, I think these two adventures are reasonably close. And while they definitely have two different approaches when it comes to adventure design, I think they're both good in their own ways. Personally, I do have a strong preference for true one-shots, especially for level 1 adventures, because I think there's something that's really powerful about being able to complete a full gameplay loop in a single session. So, you're exploring the dungeon, you're dealing with that final encounter, and then you're reaping the rewards for all of your hard work. And in my experience, sometimes you only get one session to try to pull new people in. And I feel like adventures that prolong that initial payoff and don't complete the loop in one session are just less likely to hold people's attention and bring them back for next time. And I'd be curious to know if you all have observed similar things, or if you found that long adventures work just as well. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider checking out the recap of my group's playthrough of Lost Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur. Spoiler alert, it does get a little bit spicy towards the end, but that just makes it all the more exciting. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye.